My wife and I went to visit my uncle, who unfortunately is in a hospital in New Jersey, Uncle Michal. And as we were driving, there was a lot of traffic. So I told my wife, maybe we should go into the other lane, which was going faster. It's an HOV lane, high occupancy vehicles. So we go into the HOV lane and we're driving and it's moving very quickly and we get stopped by a policeman. And I asked the policeman, officer, why we stopped? He said, well, it's a HOV lane and you need 3 people in the car. You only have 2 people in the car. So I responded, what do you mean? It's social distance. The 3rd person is in the car behind us. The Parsha is about traveling, because the Torah tells us in this week's Parsha there was a hunger, a famine in the land of Israel. And so Yitzchak and Rivka and the family travel from Israel to Plishtim, which is modern-day Gaza. And the Torah tells us, primarily in this Parsha, how Yitzchak digs wells. Number 1, he digs the wells that his father dug years before, and that was stuffed up by the Plishtim. Yitzchak now, once again, reveals the water from these wells. And then it goes on to say, he digs new wells. And he digs 3 new wells. And here the Torah gives a name for each of the wells. The first well that he dug is called Asek, which means contention. And because the shepherds were quarreling with Isaac, he called it Asek. Then they dug a second well, and they quarreled over that one as well. So Isaac named it Sitna, which means harassment. So the first well is called contention, the second is harassment. Finally, they build a 3rd well, which they call it Rechovos, or Rechovot, which means open spaces, saying that from now on, God has granted us ample space to expand, and we will flourish materially in the land. The Ramban, Nachmanides, the famous Kabbalist and Talmudist and physician, not to be confused with the Rambam. The Ramban, Nachmanides, was born 1194, which is 60 years after the birth of the Rambam. He was also born in Spain, but the Rambam was born in Cordova, and the Ramban was born in Gerona. The Ramban asks a question. He says, Yitzchak was one of the great fathers of Israel, the great patriarchs of Israel. Yet the entire story of the wells don't seem to be complementary. It doesn't show his greatness, that he was a superhero, he was a great Torah scholar, he was a miracle worker, he was able to fight great kings like his father Abraham. It simply tells us that he dug wells. And it's interesting that he also dug the wells that his father dug, implying that Abraham dug those wells earlier, yet the Torah doesn't tell us about those wells that Abraham dug. Yet here, the Torah makes it clear that it was the same wells that Abraham dug, and he also dug additional wells. So what's happening over here? Says the Ramban, there must be a very deep concept here that the Torah is teaching us. As we know, the Torah is a book of truth, a book of lesson. It's not only a book of history, but all the laws, the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah are derived from the 5 books of Moses. And furthermore, how we are to live our lives, an instruction of how to deal with every situation and challenge and harassment and contention in our life is all derived from the Torah. So what is the message here of these 3 wells and the names of these 3 wells? The Rambam tells us that these three wells represent the three holy temples. The first temple, the second temple, and the third holy temple. The first temple, as the commentaries explain, was built in the name of Avraham. The second temple was built in the name of Yitzchak. And the third temple was built in the name of Yaakov. The first temple, we know, after 410 years, was destroyed. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, and so it is a well of contention. The second holy temple was built and lasted 420 years. And that was destroyed. And before it was destroyed, you had other problems with the Greeks, the story of Hanukkah. Then came the Romans and destroyed the temple. So now it becomes the temple of harassment. The third temple will be built by Almighty God. And that's why God's name is mentioned here in verse 22. For now God has granted us ample space. And this temple will be everlasting. There will be open space and ample space to expand forever and ever and for all eternity. Now the fact that the Torah connects the wells to the holy temples is not simply by chance, but there must be a deeper relationship between a well and the holy temple. What is the connection between these be'erot, these wells, and the three holy temples? A well represents a mikveh. When a man or a woman wants to immerse in holy waters and become holier and more spiritual, they go into a mikveh. And there are two basic mikvahs, or two basic mikvaot. One is called a man-made mikveh, and that is with rainwater. And you do this by creating a cement cistern, a pool in the ground that has at least 40 sa'ah of rainwater. And then after that, you add additional city water. And that's the way you have yourself a mikveh. But that is man-made. And there are many restrictions on this. It has to be at least 40 sa'ah of rainwater, which is about 160 gallons of water. And then it cannot be zoichalin if there's a leak in the mikveh. It's not a kosher mikveh. So this is the laws and restrictions of a man-made mikveh. Then there is a mikveh which is God-made. And that is a well. It's natural water, a natural spring of water. And because it's by God, there are no restrictions. You don't need 160 gallons of water. And it does not have to be stationary in one place. It could be moving. And this is called a be'er. This is called a well, a spring of live water. But we all know that even when it comes to a be'er, a well, a spring of live water, it does need human intervention. What does that mean? You have to dig it. You have to dig the well. You have to remove all the earth and dirt. And finally, you'll go down a few feet and you're going to find that spring, that well water. They once asked the famous artist Michelangelo, how was he able to carve out and chisel out the famous David? And he said, what do you mean? I saw David in the stone, and I revealed it by chiseling it out. And by the way, he forgot to circumcise him. That's another story. But the truth is, the same is with a mikvah of a well. And that is, the water is there by God, and what you're doing is, you're revealing that water that is there. And that is really the mitzvah of building a temple. On one hand, the purpose of building a temple is that God should dwell amongst humankind. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, should come down and have a relationship between God and humankind. So the Shekhinah has to come down. On the other hand, God tells us in the Torah, "V'asu li migdash." I want you to build the temple for me. V'asu li migdash, and they shall build it. So I will dwell in that place. So we need to create the holy temple. But what we're doing is really revealing, so to speak, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, in that place. So here we see that the Be'eros, these wells that Yitzchak built, is truly a metaphor for the holy temples of his children in the future generations. We find an interesting thing in the halacha, in Jewish law, pertaining to the building of the temple. The Rambam writes, who is obligated to build the temple? Says the Rambam, men and women are equally obligated and have the obligation to build the holy temple. Now the question comes to mind, we know that women are only obligated to do a mitzvah that has a universal time zone. In other words, a woman needs to follow all 365 negative commandments of the Torah. Don't kill, don't steal, all the don'ts. But the do's, which are the positive commandments, the 248 ramach, positive commandments, only the mitzvahs that don't have a specific time-bound zone are they obligated to keep. So in other words, a mitzvah like putting on tefillin, blowing the shofar, sitting in a sukkah, which is only for a specific amount of time, a woman doesn't have the chiyuv, she doesn't have the obligation to do. If so, how can the Rambam say that the women have an obligation to build the holy temple? The holy temple was only built during the day and not at night. If that is the case, how can the Rambam say that women have this obligation to build the Beis HaMikdash, the holy temple, together with the men? And the answer is that in Halacha, in Talmud, there's a terminology called Hecht and Gavra. Hecht means the object, Gavra means the person. So there are two things here. There's the obligation on the person to build the temple, and then there's the obligation for the temple to be built. So it depends what we're looking at. If we're looking at the Gavra, the person, you're right. A woman should not be obligated to build the temple, because the temple was only built during the day, not at night. And therefore, there are restrictions to the positive commandment, and a woman has no obligation to keep positive commandments that are limited to a specific time zone. However, if we look at it from the Heftza, from the point of the object, that the object has to be built, the holy temple has to be built, then it doesn't matter men or women. Everybody has the obligation equally to make sure this temple gets built. And that is the way we understand the halacha in Rambam, that there's an obligation for the temple to be built. And therefore every person, regardless who you are, man or woman, have the responsibility and the obligation to make sure that this happens. So now we have the three holy temples. The first one is Avraham, the second one is Yitzchak, the third one is Yaakov. Yet, where does the Torah tell us the entire episode about the details and the names of these wells? Only by Yitzchak. By Avraham it's hinted, he was in Beersheba. He also made a treaty together with Avimelech. But the entire detailed organization of building these wells is primarily by Yitzchak. Why? Why is it by Yitzchak we have the entire episode of building these wells, not by Avraham and not by Yaakov? Everything in Torah is exact. There are no mistakes. It's not random. It's not by chance. Avraham represents chesed, kindness. Kindness is basically an act from above to below. The benefactor gives the beneficiary. Yaakov represents the study of Torah. Torah represents God coming down to the mountain. What does Yitzchak represent? Avoda, work, prayer. A person stands below and prays to God above. Prayer is called avodah. It's called work. It's about toil. And the building of the temple is all about toil. It's the human being's involvement in creating this dwelling place for God. And therefore, to underscore that the building of the temple is not simply God coming down, but rather we creating this place, this edifice, this temple, for God to be able to dwell. This concept is underscored by the fact Torah teaches us the story of Yitzchak digging these wells, that we too have to dig, we too have to toil, we too have to endeavor to create the Holy Temple. And when do we have to do this? Not only when we are in Jerusalem, not only when we are on the Temple Mount, not only in a time of peace and tranquility, but regardless where a person finds himself, any place in the world, we have this mitzvah of Asur li Mikdash every single day to build a holy dwelling place for God. And that is, of course, by studying Torah, by doing mitzvahs, by giving tzedakah, charity. This is the way we create a holy edifice. This is the way we create a holy temple for God. Another interesting contradiction that we find pertaining to the third holy temple. On one hand, the Gemara says in the tractate of Ksubis that Gedolim Ma'aseh Tzadikim Yoisei Ma'aseh Shemayim V'Aretz. It says that the actions of the righteous are greater, are Yoisei, from the actions of God. Why? For God created heaven and earth with one hand, and the Tzadikim created the holy temple with two hands. On the other hand, it says that God will build the third holy temple. And even the verse that implies that tzaddikim, righteous people, built the holy temple, it's also a verse of Mikdash Adnai, the temple of God, which was prepared by your hands, God. So is it the hands of the righteous, or is it the hands of God? And especially the third holy temple, which according to most of the sages will come down from heaven. It's going to be built by God himself. How do we connect this with the idea of Yitzchak digging the wells and creating the temple for God? And the answer is, that this temple that God is going to create, this third holy temple, was created by tzaddikim, was created by righteous people, was created by the human beings. The last 1900 years of exile, when we constantly strove to follow Torah and mitzvahs, even at a time of challenge and hardship and sickness and death, yet the Jewish people, even under all of these dire circumstances of harassment, constantly built this temple spiritually by doing Torah and mitzvahs. And then, when God is going to build this third holy temple, this third holy temple will be a byproduct of our actions, of the actions of the Amich Kulam Tzadikim, a nation of righteous people, who are able to build this holy temple throughout the hardships and the challenges of life. There was a chassid by the name of Michael Bliner. They called him Michael the elder Michael. And he was a mashgiach in the yeshiva in Lubavitch. And he would tell his disciples, he says, you know, in the days of old, there were Jews, villagers. They were called yeshuvniks. They would live in a village. Why were they in the village? Because, unfortunately, they were not allowed to have jobs in universities or in hospitals. So they would live in the outskirts, in the hills, on the farms. And that's the way they earned a living. Sometimes you had a few Yidden, a few villagers who were Jewish in a larger village. And sometimes you only had one Jew who was a villager. And because they were far from the main city, and they were far from the metropolis, many of them never had the opportunity to learn how to read and to write. They were ignorant. When you had a few villagers together, they would hire a teacher, a malamed, a tutor, to come and teach their children. So the story is told that one day the villager gets a letter. And the problem is he doesn't know how to read it. So he goes to the tutor and says to the tutor, please read this letter for me. The tutor, who's able to read Hebrew without the vowels on it and understand it, he begins to read the letter. In the letter it says that this villager's father passed away. And he's reading the letter. As he's reading the letter that you should know your father passed away, the villager faints right there and then on the floor. Rabbi Michal the Elder asked the question to his disciples, and he said, look, the tutor is the one reading the letter, and he doesn't faint. But the villager who's listening to the letter, he's the one that faints. Why is that? It should be the opposite. The one who actually has the letter and reading the letter, he should faint. But what's the answer? The obvious answer is, it's not about me. It's about him. It doesn't bother me what happened. I'm just the tutor. I'm just conveying the message. But really, the message is for him, not for me. Michal said the same is true when we study Torah. Many of us read Torah like it's a letter for somebody else. Oh, the Torah says, put on tefillin. Very nice, you should do that. The Torah says, keep kosher. That's very nice, you should do it. Oh, the Torah says you should dig wells and you should prepare the Holy Temple. It's a very nice story about Yitzchak, who lived thousands of years ago. But I'm the tutor, I'm just reading the letter. It has nothing to do with me. Says Ramchal, when you read the Torah, you should faint. Wow, the Torah is telling me I have to dig wells. The Torah is telling me to create that temple. It has to be al-liba de nafshe. It has to be that the Torah is having a personal relationship with me. So we hope and pray that as we read the portion of Toldos, we read the portion of offsprings, God should bless us that we should have beautiful offsprings, children and grandchildren, who go in the way of Torah and mitzvahs and are productive citizens of society to bring light and joy. And the ultimate blessing, the third holy temple, B'mheira B'imenu. Amen.